Hi, it's January 20th, 2016, and I am with Professor Peter Sheehan, whom I have interviewed previously. Peter has been a prolific researcher in the field of hypnosis and has particularly emphasized the domain of phenomenology and its relevance to hypnosis practice. And the previous interview took place a few years ago in Brisbane, Peter's home. And now for the perfect symmetry, Peter's in my home in Fallbrook, California, and we have the opportunity to continue our conversation. What I want to be able to do in this conversation is get some insight about his experience in the laboratories of Martin Orne and Ernest Hilgard. Peter has known many of the most important figures in the field of hypnosis and people who helped shape his seminal research at University of Queensland in the hypnosis lab there. And so the opportunity to gain some insights into how this field has evolved and who some of the important players were and some of the more personal reflections I think would be invaluable, and I hope you'll enjoy this conversation. Thank you, Peter, for being willing to do this.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for that introduction.
Sure. All right, so let's go back to when you were a young graduate student yourself and ended up in Martin Orne's lab. Can you talk about what that experience was like, how it shaped your perceptions about hypnosis and hypnosis research, and any observations about your experience of Martin Orne in particular and anybody else who was associated with those research projects?
It was a fairly intense experience because it was my first exposure to a range of intellectuals. I worked in the unit for experimental psychiatry. There with me was Ronald Shor. Martin Orne I had frequent interactions with in relation to his way of looking at hypnosis. He had a number of individuals around him that had their own rather more experimental look at what hypnosis does, but in that sense it was a fairly intense experience. I think my interactions with Martin were coloured by my feeling and impressions and judgment that he was a wonderful clinician. I think his concept of demand characteristics was an extremely significant concept for the area. It spanned or led to a whole range of experimental approaches to hypnosis that I think were important for the area. I think what I learned from Martin actually was the sensitivity which I think the field needed to hear to implicit cues and interactions in social communications. I see Martin being strongly influenced by a social orientation to the way you consider hypnosis, but he had a subtlety, a clinical subtlety about looking at what cues actually meant and in ways that you haven't thought about before. And in terms of my own research, which is not what this is all about, but I think the best research I ever done or ever did was taking up the implications of what I heard, analysing the communications, and then proceeding to theorise about what that meant. Now that pushed me into a whole range of orientations that was beyond just social psychological theorising. I was exposed to transference, the importance of that in the clinical literature. And I think that also relates to the influence that Martin Orne had on me. He was an intellectual of wonderfully subtle acumen in the way he talked about hypnosis, and I enjoyed my interactions with him immensely. He was a powerful, big, influential individual, and I had little dealings with him as a psychiatrist. I suppose I read in the clinical literature about the hello goodbye effect, And I understand what it means from the clinical literature, but when you're actually interacting with Martin Orne, you realise immediately the implication of, hello, I'm sick, goodbye, I have to be better. And it was the impact of that in my interactions which certainly broadened my horizons about what clinical psychology and theorising had to offer the field of hypnosis.
Was he studying demand characteristics just in the clinical context or research context at that time?
In the
Or
research context.
was he looking at memory yet? Is that where you got your interest in memory? Because he had done some of the first experiments on false memories that ended up shaping many legal issues to come that came almost single-handedly. He dismantled forensic hypnosis. And eventually, this is some of the research that you were doing on false memories. Was that inspired by him, or did you come to that on your own?
Well, I know I didn't come to my own. I think very few of us come to a field on our own without having to admit the influence of significant others.
Sure.
My feeling is that I did come to it. No doubt it was influenced by my interactions with Martin Orne. But the thrust of my interactions with him was really looking at the cues, social implications, clinical implications of what goes on between an experimenter and a subject, a hypnotist,
Right.
and someone else, significant other. And that was the thrust to me. I never had any feeling that my interactions with him were at all ever divorced from the experimental context. But I had respect for him for having clinical acumen in the experimental setting. And there are a number of directions I have gone as a result of knowing Martin Orne, which he might be a little surprised at, given our interactions. So in some sense, I went into areas of my own accord, but I think they were subtly influenced by my interactions with a lot of people.
So, any particular specific things that you can point to that in your interactions with Orne that really stuck with you?
I think one of the elusive concepts that I struggled with, and I'm not sure I've ever solved, I'm not sure can be solved, is through my interactions with Martin Orne, I came to query what on earth, socially speaking, an experiment's really about. And when I come in as a subject to an experimenter, what is it this experiment's about? This experiment has to have a purpose. What is that purpose? And they can be unconscious, subconsciously considered by the subject. And I came virtually of my own accord, I think, to feeling, well, how about I flirt with the idea of self-disclosure in the experimental setting? In other words, how do I divorce myself from the, quote, hidden purposes of the experiment? And I got into Sidney Deward's work on self-disclosure. And I flirted with the idea, and I published in this field, I flirted with the idea of saying to the subject, look, I'm not going to ask you any question unless I'm willing to answer it to you if you ask the same question of me. I found that a very intriguing process. It's an extension of what I learnt about in those early days. And I came to the conclusion that, in a sense, you can never fully escape, you can never fully establish a total self-disclosing environment within the experimental setting. Now, I'm not sure what that does when I look back on some of the work I've done. In some of that work, it doesn't really matter, but it was a lesson to me to think of the experiment as really goes a little bit of the way to self-disclosing, mutual self-disclosing, but stops.
So in the context of hypnosis experimentation, what did you observe Orne doing that you did pick up on and integrate for yourself in your own research? And what did you leave behind because for one reason or another it just didn't fit for you?
Well, I think the most significant thing that impressed me and certainly influenced the work I did was my interactions with him about post-hypnotic responding. And the way of analysing post-hypnotic responding in a way that will alert you to what really are the social cues going on. And in his lab, I was interviewing an assistant to a psychiatrist, a psychiatric aide, when suddenly, in the middle of a regular interview, his hand came up to his face. I said to myself, what on earth is going on here? And immediately I thought of what are the demand characteristics that's been established that could possibly be an expecting response. Now, from that single observation of one person doing an unusual thing at a time I was involved with Martin intensely in post-hypnotic response, Martin let me go with it, and from it was 9 years of experimental programmatic research that I regard as the best research I've ever done. And to me, I'm making that comment from my satisfaction, and what intrigues me, it was 9 years of work solely based on a clinical, experimental, passing observation of an unusual response that I think I would not have been alert to in quite that way had I not had frequent interactions with Martin Orne about the nature of post-hypnotic responding.
So how did that work exactly? Would you sit around a table and talk about people's hypnotic responses over a cup of coffee? Was there a formal kind of educational process going on of how to integrate into the lab and follow lab protocols? Was it in services where he'd bring in other experts to talk about different aspects of hypnosis? I know Milton Erickson went through his lab.
Yeah.
What were the actual dynamics of how all that worked?
Well, it wasn't quite as structured as you're implying there. And I think there was a lot of transfer of what my interactions with Martin Orne were to my extension. I would say, heavens, what's going on here? I would have taken that back to him, and I would have had observations about it to him. And my feeling is, and this is pretty much Martin's style, he takes what you say and you start what you think is going to be an informal conversation about them. But it's much more formal when you look back on it after a period of time. And I think I had conversations with him about the meaning of that. But the extension of what it meant to me was really picked up in Australia in 9 years of research in my thinking about what did that single observation mean experimentally that locked me into research in Australia. While I was in Australia, I would have had virtually no interactions with Martin Orne about the meaning of that. But I think what matters with my interactions with Martin was my alert to the social significance of a single, mildly cued observation that locked me subsequently out of interactions with Martin Orne into a program of work that comes to be my most self-satisfying research.
And when you look at others who were with you at that time, perhaps most notably Ronald Shor, arguably maybe, he developed his own perspective about what was happening too. Can you talk a little bit about Ronald Shor's work and the whole reality testing perspective, reality orientation perspective?
Yes, I think probably out of all the people I interacted with, and I interacted with Ulrich Neisser in his lab, and that very much cued me to memory. So if anything influenced me later on in terms of memory, it was probably the stimulation of my interactions with Ulrich Neisser in Martin Orne's lab. Now, with Ronald Shor, what really has significantly influeed my work is his development of a phenomenological model of hypnosis. And whereas I would sit down with Martin and talk about the significance of what I've seen, and also we would talk about his theorising and what were my reflections on it, I never had that sort of interaction with Ronald Shor, but his phenomenological model was extraordinarily influential on me, particularly as I developed my work back in Australia. With Martin, you interacted sort of what seemed to be informally but wasn't. With Ronald Shor, you kind of struggled to extract from him the interactions you wanted. He was a highly organised individual. I think you could say he was obsessively so. And I admired his obsessiveness and organisation. And I find it constantly intriguing that he developed a phenomenological model, which to me has a flexibility about it. You go with what you see, the appearance of things, what does it mean, which weren't really up there in front in personal interactions with Ronald Shor. So I owe him an enormous contribution theoretically, conceptually, but in my interactions with him, I always felt that dissonance between his style as a person and what he was producing. And what mattered to me at the time, as a young researcher, is what he was producing. I liked Ronald Shor, but I was constantly intrigued by how well organised and obsessive he was, in a positive sense, with what he was producing intellectually, which to me had a degree of phenomenological flexibility. I don't think that phenomenological flexibility was something I was looking for in Martin Orne. I found it unexpectedly in Ronald Shor.
How would you, you went through Hilgard's lab, you spent some time with Hilgard as well. How, was there a strong overlap between the way they did things, or were they very different kinds of environments in which to explore hypnosis?
The people I've interacted with over on the Philadelphia coast were believing in the sorts of things that are highly compatible with Hilgard's lab. The nature of individual differences, the importance of traits. I think both the West and the East, Hilgard and Orne, were very much tied into the importance of the Stanford scales. We would have used the Stanford, or I would have used the Stanford scales in all that I did, and I think probably the others did too. So in a sense, in the recognition of the importance of skills, traits, and the importance of individual differences, there was a real harmony between the two groups. And but in a sense, in working at Stanford, and as part of my interaction, I was there as a scholar at the time, and I was there as a postdoc researcher with Martin's lab. I got a lot more out of personal interactions with the people around me at Martin's lab than I did with Hilgard, but I didn't have the expectancy that I would not get that. I knew what I was getting from both labs. And I've always injected into my own theorising the importance of trait approaches. I think probably when I extend what I think into the broader psychological domain about the influence of situation, the influence of trait, I think I learnt of the influence of situation more about how important that is from Martin's lab than I did from Hilgard's. But I never lost awareness of the importance of trait and skill that Hilgard's lab had. And what I've done, and I'm not sure they would agree with what I said, I think there's a really complex interaction between situational components components and skill components. And I think that, for me, transfers across the experimental clinical divide. I think the clinical situation has a lot more situational impact and influence in it than trait. I think the experimental situation, trait is very important. And I think both of them, in my general theorizing, both of them really have to be conceptualized in a complex way. They're both very important.
So the whole domain of phenomenology has had a pretty huge resurgence in the last 5 to 10 years. I don't know how much you've been following it, Ron Bacala in particular, but new instruments being developed, a much stronger emphasis, and really in light of what you're saying about state versus trait and situational influences. Tell me if you think I'm right or wrong about this, but it's part of how I looked at Ronald Shor's contributions. His whole emphasis was on reality testing, reality orientation, and of course the recognition that reality is subjectively conceived, hence the importance of the phenomenological aspect of it. For clinicians who are constantly dealing with subjective realities, highly subjective realities, what about hypnosis as a treatment tool? Do you see it as helping people explore those subjective realities is an important thing to do, or do you think that compounds difficulties in some way, and a more structured approach might be better? Can you speculate on how all this plays out clinically?
It's just speculation, and I'm not a clinician, and I don't claim to be a therapist, but I'm constantly intrigued by the experimental clinical divide. I actually think the appearances of things are critical, and not being a clinician, I would think that it's critical to, no matter whether you're an experimentalist or a clinician, to really explore the perceptions of people. Now, be it clients, be it subjects. Now, I really think that the field, in a sense, has not picked up as intensively as it might the lessons of Magnusson's work in looking at situational and trait components. And I always remember his statement that when someone comes to you thinking that someone has been aggressive, and that's something you very much go to a clinician in the clinical context, as to an experimental in particular context. And he made the point that, what happens if I said to you that my right shoe is aggressive? And people get shocked at that. It's a ridiculously inane comment to make. But he said, look, the critical thing is not the aggression, it's that you see the perception of aggression. And I think that's lesson came to psychology at a particular period and was distilled in particular ways. But I think no one has yet fully explored the implications of that in the clinical setting, experimental setting, of what that really means. And you're a clinician and I'm not, and you can make comment on that, but I actually think that the perceptions of people are critical. And that's difficult. I mean, I say one, that person is extremely aggressive. It's hard to get on with. But what really matters is that, I see that person as aggressive and hard to get on with. And it's so easy for me to slip into an assumption of reality when it's not. I'm really working with the appearances of things. If I was a clinician, I think I'm not sure I would differ very much from what I've just said to you.
What about the role of hypnosis in that process? How does hypnosis elicit or create a demand characteristic for a particular reality?
Well, that shades over, as you could probably imagine, and I'm extending you on that one, shades over into what does hypnosis do to make you a person that's particularly desirous to please. And I think demand characteristic slots into that in a general sense. What are the implications for what I want from what I'm doing and what you're seeing? My predilection in hypnosis, and not everyone would agree, that I think in hypnosis there's, for some people, and I'm really talking about somnambules, for some people it goes further than that. That the perception of cues about what he or she wants shades over into I want to do what he or she wants. And that immediately raises the relevance to me of concepts like transference. Now, Shor was very important in that when he talked about archaic involvement. His loss of generalized reality orientation, the phenomenal field, subjectively accepting it, and archaic involvement. And we're now into talking about, in hypnosis, that archaic involvement. Now, I think what matters in hypnosis, and it's a particular viewpoint, is what really characterizes the best of hypnosis. I'm not really interested in you very much if you're low to low medium.
So you mean best in terms of ability to respond?
Yeah.
Okay.
But if I'm confident that I've got a really susceptible person here, that's where my gold lies in terms of theorizing, experimenting. My 9 years of research was on a gold somnambulistic subject. I don't think I could ever spend that time in worrying about what might characterize a medium susceptible person. So when I'm talking about archaic involvement, extending you in terms of desires to please, I'm really applying that to what I think about a person who's deeply susceptible.
Well, you use the term susceptible.
Yes.
Do you equate that with, or is it somehow different than the term hypnotic responsiveness?
I think that's a very meaningful question. And again, I'm not a therapist or a clinician. Meaningful question in the clinical context, much more meaningful than it is in the experimental context. I think in the experimental context, with the role of the experimenter, the role of the subject, the demand characteristic implications of the procedures, the intent to do what the experimenter wants, and that's a spin-off to Rosenthal's work on experimental bias. I actually think that has a structured role to play, those concepts, much more structured in the experimental context than the clinical. I would say in the clinical context, and I go back to my earlier remarks, the balance between situational influence and trait influence can be reversed. And I think in the clinical context, situational components are extremely important. In the experimental context, I think responsiveness in a much more standard way, certainly as it's reflected in the papers in the literature, is important.
Let me ask it a little differently then. If somebody is administered the Stanford scale and the score is derived of this person's susceptibility to hypnosis, do you believe, as Hilgard did, that this is a fixed capacity, or do you believe that somebody's hypnotizability or capacity for hypnotic responsiveness can change over time?
It's an interesting question. I suppose as an experimentalist, I would believe, and let's talk about somnambulistic, deeply susceptible people. Let's talk about them in a way I don't think, as an experimentalist, I could ever change an insusceptible person into a somnambule. But I think in a clinical context I might.
Really? Okay.
Now, so the issue of change means something very different to me in the clinical context than it does in the experimental context. There are so many things operating socially, motivationally, perceptually, in the experimental context to mitigate against that kind of change that I see the clinical context as a whole realm of different situational components.
I think you might have just encapsulated the subtle disagreements between Hilgard and Erickson. Hilgard, as an experimentalist, was dead set against the notion of hypnotic responsiveness changing over time. He would get into it with Erickson being the consummate clinician, who saw hypnotic responsiveness as very much something that you alluded to, the situational factors actually outweighing trait factors. Did you run into that with Erickson at all? Did you run into that with Hilgard at all? Did that issue surface in any of your interactions?
Not as extremely as you phrased it there. And let me go back to your original question, and as a challenge to that question. I think when you talk about sort of trait responsiveness and situational responsiveness, when you talk about situational influence, I actually open my mind to the possibility that when I am able to change a so-called insusceptible person to a deeply susceptible person, I think that's possible in the clinical context, impossible in the experimental context. And
because of the rigidity of the protocols? Or
probably because of the constraints of the experimental setting. And you talk about hypnosis. I'm not sure, when I look on that change in the clinical context, I'm necessarily happy with saying hypnosis is the cause of that. I could be just as comfortable, even more comfortable, with that change being due to the transference component between subject, client, and therapist. So when you say how much is hypnosis involved in that, while I think that change is possible in the clinical context, and I might expect it, I'm less certain about the dimensions responsible for that change, and I'm less certain to take hypnosis out from the broader context. I'm less certain that it might not just be transference that's doing it, not hypnosis. Oddly enough, while I think transference operates with some susceptible people in the clinical context, I'm not as eager to separate them in the experimental context. I'm not as eager to separate them in the clinical context as in the experimental context. So when you say how much is due to hypnosis, I think the clinical context is extremely complicated. I can get behavioural changes for different reasons that I won't get behavioural changes in the experimental context.
So then, what's your view of somebody like Erickson, who has a very different view of hypnosis, a much more flexible view of hypnosis than Orne had or Hilgard had?
I only worked with Erickson very directly as a visitor to Orne's lab, so I'm less certain in theoretical terms about what I might say about Erickson, but I was always conscious with Erickson of an extraordinary ability in his communications with people. I found with Erickson that his communication, as a personal comment, was loaded. I found my interactions with him, I could see layers of meaning to it. I think with Orne, for instance, there was a layers of meaning you would later think, oh, were they there? With Erickson, layers of meaning I knew instantly were there. And that is not detracting from my respect for what he's done or who he is, but I see him as a wonderfully clinical expert practitioner who, again, is an expert in communication, but his use of that communication is very different from Orne's. And in a personal sense, my reaction to it is different with Erickson and with Orne. I knew immediately it was a different ball game in interacting with Erickson than it was with Orne, and you'd expect that.
So the fact that Erickson is the centerpiece of modern clinical hypnosis, the fact that there are 140 Erickson institutes around the world and an Erickson Foundation headquartered in Phoenix, clinicians have embraced them so strongly, and experimentalists not so much. Where's the gap?
Look, I think with Erickson, I had immediately the feeling he was a clinical, influential person in communicating with me. With Orne and Hilgard, they were influential. I didn't have as much the impression of clinical influence, and I guess I'm sure this is a very personal comment. I have a feeling of obvious nature of influence in the communications between myself and Erickson that were there in Hilgard and Orne, but I cottoned onto them later. Now, I think I can understand some of the reasons I've already given. I think in experimental work there is a notable absence of subtlety and detection of influences that are not so easy to verbalize or to articulate. I can imagine in the clinical setting where those processes are very important, the influence of Erickson I would expect to be much stronger.
Ask about your own personal experience with hypnosis. Did any of these people do hypnosis with you? Did Orne do hypnosis with you? Did Hilgard do hypnosis with you? Did Erickson do hypnosis with you?
Hilgard did. He looked on my practice of the experiential analysis technique, which was very soon after I arrived in Stanford, and I made a complete failure of it. I was just overawed by the structure of the Stanford setting. It's a very competitive environment, Stanford University, and I really need to loosen up before I did that. So in that sense, yes, Hilgard. I'm not conscious of Orne doing that. I think he must have, but it doesn't stand out to me as much as my memory of Hilgard.
So who did hypnosis with you that got you into the experience of it?
Way back?
Yeah.
I did my Ph.D. in imagery, and I think that was very relevant to the number of things we're talking about too. And I think intellectually the person that got me into the field was Phil Sutcliffe.
Who did hypnosis with you?
No. But
I'm talking from the experiential side of it. Who did hypnosis with you where you'd sit up, open your eyes, and go, wow, that was amazing?
Look, to be honest, I think I did that mostly myself.
Really?
With the background of the intellectual discussions I had with Phil Sutcliffe, Gordon Hammer, who was much more, had a sense of dynamism in his interactions with you. But I had a feeling, I would swat up the literature, swat up techniques. I'm not conscious.
It's a curious thing to me, though, that you're in these labs with these major hypnosis experts, and nobody says to you, sit down, close your eyes, we're going to do some hypnosis now?
I'm not conscious of it. They may have, but it's a long time ago.
Okay. All right. Well, clearly, I mean, it would have stood out if these were greatly significant experiences
but,
for you.
I would talk about what I'd seen, what I'd done. And the way I've learned about hypnosis was really goes back to the phenomenological thing.
Yeah.
When I would recruit subjects in a university setting for my experiments, and I remember one guy knocked on the door. I opened it. He said, "Are you Dr. Sheehan? Did you ask me to be a subject for hypnosis experiment?" And I said, "Yes, that's right." He just collapsed into my hands. And within seconds, he was in a somnambulistic trance. Now, it's hard not to be impressed with that.
It is true. That would be difficult.
And that says something about not only skill,
Yeah.
but other components as well. Now, those sorts of experiences were immensely formative to me in how I went about hypnosis.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up. I'll say I'm envious of the kinds of experiences that you've had, the people that you've known, the opportunities that you had. I came to this field in the late 70s, and I just didn't have the opportunity to get to know these people. So it really is a treat to hear some of your observations about what it was like to be with them.
I could relay that envy back, Michael, and you know I would. You had enormous interactions with influential people who've gained enormously by their interactions with you.
Well, it's been a satisfying career, I think, for both of us. But you're one of those people for different reasons that has been significant for me. Thanks a lot for taking the time to talk with me.
Thanks for our interaction.
Appreciate it. It's fun. It's fun.